What happens when the lowest-ranking, utterly broken member of a pack does the one thing the most feared ruler in the realm could not? They say a rejected mate is destined to die of a broken heart. But Isolde's heartbreak didn't kill her. It brought a dead princess back to life. The rain did not fall the night Rhys broke Isolde's heart. The sky was as dry and cold as the eyes of the man she had loved since childhood. In the heart of the Silverpine territory, under the watchful gaze of Lord Godfrey and the pack elders, the cruel words were spoken. I, Rhys of the Silverpine pack, reject you, Isolde, as my fated mate and future Luna. You are an Omega, weak in blood and spirit. I require a warrior, not a servant. The words were not just a rejection. They were a physical blow. Isolde remembered collapsing to the stone floor of the pack house, gasping for air, as the mate bond violently snapped. It was a searing, agonizing tear in her very soul. She didn't scream, she couldn't. The pain had stolen her voice, much like the betrayal had stolen her future. She was given less than an hour to pack her meager belongings before being escorted to the borders by guards who had once called her a friend. Banished and broken, Isolde wandered into the Frost Peak Mountains. For weeks she survived on roots melted snow and the sheer stubborn refusal to let Rhys's cruelty be the end of her story. She was an Omega, yes, but Omegas were the caretakers, the survivors, the ones who endured the burdens of the pack. She wrapped herself in her tattered wool cloak, her body shivering, her wolf spirit entirely dormant, retreating deep inside her consciousness to hide from the pain of the severed bond. Her wandering came to an abrupt halt near the territory lines of the Ironclaw pack. She was discovered half-frozen by Captain Arthur, the lead border patrol for the most formidable pack in the Northern Realm. The Ironclaws were legendary, known for their impenetrable fortress, their elite warriors, and their ruler, Alpha King Rambo Hargreaves. Rambo was a name whispered to frighten disobedient pups. He was a colossal man, a ruthless tactician who had conquered 4 neighboring territories. But behind the iron-fisted rule lay a tragedy that the entire realm knew, but dared not speak of. 3 years ago, his mate, Lady Vivian, was ambushed and murdered by a coalition of rogue wolves. She had died protecting their only child, Princess Cecilia. Cecilia had survived the attack, but the trauma had fundamentally broken the little girl. She was only 5 years old when she witnessed her mother's death, and since that blood-soaked night, Cecilia had not uttered a single word. She had not cried. She had not smiled. She moved through the grand, shadowy halls of the Ironclaw castle like a small, hollow ghost. Alpha King Rambo had brought in the finest healers, the most powerful shamans, and the most engaging jesters from across the continent. None could breach the invisible wall Cecilia had built around herself. The failure to heal his daughter had hardened Rambo into stone. He became a king who ruled entirely without mercy, for all his mercy had died with his mate. When Isolde was dragged before the castle's seneschal, she expected execution or imprisonment. Instead, recognizing the fading scent of a rejected mate and her undeniably submissive Omega nature, they threw her into the castle kitchens. You will scrub the kettles, you will tend the hearths, and you will keep your eyes lowered, instructed Martha, the stern head cook, her hands dusted with flour. This is a house of mourning Omega. Keep your sorrow to yourself. The king has enough of his own. Isolde accepted her fate. The warmth of the roaring kitchen fires was a luxury she hadn't felt in weeks. She buried her grief in her labor. Her hands became raw from lye, and hot water, her back ached from carrying sacks of root vegetables. But the physical exhaustion was a welcome distraction from the agonizing void in her chest. She was a ghost in her own right, moving silently among the clattering pans and yelling cooks, unnoticed and unbothered. But grief is a language of its own, and those who speak it fluently can always recognize the accent in another. Isolde did not know it yet, but her quiet suffering was about to intersect with the deepest wound of the Iron Claw King. Weeks turned into months, and winter tightened its icy grip on the Iron Claw fortress. Isolde had settled into a rhythm. She was often tasked with the earliest shifts, waking long before dawn to stoke the massive hearths and begin kneading dough for the day's bread. It was during these quiet, solitary hours that Isolde allowed herself to hum. It was a low, mournful melody, an old lullaby her mother used to sing before she passed away. It was the only time Isolde let the remnants of her heart bleed out. One brisk grey morning, a sudden clatter broke the silence of the kitchen. Isolde turned from the wooden kneading trough, wiping flour from her forehead. Standing in the doorway of the pantry was a tiny figure engulfed in a dark velvet nightgown. It was Princess Cecilia. The little girl looked pale and fragile, her dark hair a tangled mess, clutching a small object to her chest. Isolde immediately dropped to her knees, bowing her head. She knew the rules. Never look the royal family in the eye. Never speak unless spoken to. But the silence stretched on. No guards rushed in. No scolding nannies appeared. It was just the rejected Omega and the silent princess. Slowly, Isolde raised her eyes. Cecilia wasn't looking at her with the usual hollow stare that the castle staff whispered about. The girl was staring at the floor, where a beautifully carved wooden wolf lay broken in two. It had slipped from her grasp when she entered. Isolde looked at the broken toy, then back at the little girl. Cecilia's lower lip quivered slightly, but true to her cursed nature, she made no sound. She just stared at the fractured pieces of the only toy her mother had ever made for her, forgetting the strict rules of the castle, forgetting her place as a lowly kitchen. Omega Isolde's instincts took over. She recognized the profound, suffocating weight of losing something irreplaceable. Isolde wiped her flour-dusted hands on her coarse apron and slowly crawled forward on her knees, keeping her movements gentle and non-threatening, like approaching a spooked pup. "It hurts, doesn't it?" Isolde whispered, her voice raspy from disuse, yet incredibly soft. Cecilia flinched slightly but didn't run away. Isolde carefully picked up the two pieces of the wooden wolf. "When something breaks, it feels like the whole world stops." She continued, not looking at the princess, but keeping her focus on the toy. "People tell you to just get a new one, or they tell you to forget about it. But they don't understand that the pieces left behind are still precious." Up in the shadows of the servants' gallery overlooking the kitchens, a towering figure stood completely still. Alpha King Rambo had been pacing the castle in the throes of insomnia, a common affliction since Vivian's death. He had heard the faint humming, and followed it only to witness his mute daughter standing mere feet away from a strange, ragged servant. His first instinct was to roar, to summon the guards, and throw the Omega into the dungeons for daring to approach the princess. His hand gripped the stone balustrade, his knuckles turning white, his alpha aura flaring violently. But he stopped. Something in the Omega's voice pinned him to the spot. It wasn't pity. Pity was what the nobles offered. Pity was what the healers brought. This woman's voice was vibrating with raw, shared agony. Down in the kitchen, Isolde reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small, sticky lump of pine resin she used to waterproof her worn-out boots. She moved closer to the hearth, warming the resin until it became pliable, then carefully pressed the two halves of the wooden wolf together, holding them tight. "You see," Isolde murmured, looking at the fire as the resin set, I broke not too long ago. Someone I loved told me I wasn't good enough, and they snapped my heart right down the middle, just like this little wolf." Cecilia took a tiny step forward, her large, dark eyes fixed on Isolde. "I thought I was going to stay broken forever." Isolde smiled a sad, self-deprecating curve of her lips. "And maybe a part of me always will be. But there's a secret about broken things." Isolde turned back to the princess and held out her hand. Resting on her palm was the wooden wolf, whole again, though a distinct dark line of amber resin marked where the break had been. "When you put the pieces back together, the cracks don't make you ugly," Isolde whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "They show that you survived. The gold in the cracks makes you stronger. It makes you a warrior in your own right." She gently placed the mended wolf into Cecilia's small hands. Cecilia looked down at the toy. She ran her tiny thumb over the ridge of the hardened resin. For a long, agonizing minute, the kitchen was dead silent, save for the crackling of the hearth. Then something miraculous happened. Cecilia looked up at Isolde. The lifeless glaze that had clouded the child's eyes for 3 years seemed to fracture. The corners of the little girl's mouth twitched, and then slowly, tentatively like a flower blooming in the middle of a brutal winter, Princess Cecilia smiled. It wasn't a fleeting grimace. It was a genuine, radiant smile. She hugged the wooden wolf to her chest, stepped forward, and wrapped her small, fragile arms around Isolde's neck, burying her face into the Omega's flower-dusted shoulder. Isolde gasped, entirely frozen, before slowly bringing her arms up to carefully hug the child back, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Up in the gallery, the fearsome Alpha King Rambo Hargreaves, the man who had slaughtered entire armies without blinking, felt his knees buckle. He pressed his back against the cold stone wall, sliding down until he was crouching in the shadows. He clamped a massive calloused hand over his mouth to muffle the choked sob that violently tore its way out of his throat. Tears, hot, desperate, and entirely uncontrollable, streamed down the king's face. For 3 years he had lived in an emotional graveyard. He had thrown gold and power at his daughter's grief, entirely missing what she actually needed. She didn't need a king to fix her. She needed someone who knew exactly what it felt like to be broken. Rambo peered through the stone balusters, his tear-filled eyes locked onto the frail, ragged Omega holding his daughter. At that exact moment, a strange, dormant warmth sparked deep within his chest, and his inner wolf silent. Since Vivienne's demise, suddenly stirred, scratching at the walls of his mind with a single, undeniable instinct. Mate. The realization struck Alpha King Rambo with the devastating force of a falling portcullis. Up in the shadowed gallery, his breath hitched in his throat. The scent that had previously been entirely masked by the overwhelming, pungent odors of kitchen grease, burning wood, and harsh lye soap now hit his heightened alpha senses with startling, undeniable clarity. Beneath the soot and the flour that coated her fragile frame, the ragged Omega smelled of wild heather, rain-soaked earth, and sweet, pure honey. It was a scent that bypassed his logical mind and slammed directly into his soul. It was the scent of his second chance. It was the scent of his fated mate. His inner wolf, dormant and grieving for 3 long years, clawed frantically at the walls of his consciousness, howling a single primal demand. Claim. Protect. Mine. Rambo's hands gripped the stone balustrade so hard, the ancient rock began to crack under his fingers. Every instinct in his massive body urged him to leap down into the kitchen, to scoop the fragile woman into his arms, and to annihilate anyone who had ever caused her harm. But Rambo was not just a wolf. He was a master tactician, a king who had survived betrayals, assassinations, and brutal wars by never acting on pure, unfiltered impulse. He looked down at the beautiful, heartbreaking scene below. Isolde was holding his deeply traumatized daughter, rocking her gently. He knew that if he, a towering, heavily scarred alpha, charged in and aggressively claimed an already broken and rejected Omega, he would utterly shatter her. Worse, he would break whatever fragile, miraculous trust she had just built with little Cecilia. Forcing his raging wolf into submission, Rambo retreated to his chambers. His heart pounded, a frantic, terrifying rhythm against his ribs. For the first time in 3 years, the undisputed Iron Claw King felt a paralyzing fear. It was not the fear of war or death, but the profound terror of failing the 2 women who now held his battered soul in their hands. The very next morning, the chaotic, bustling rhythm of the castle kitchens was shattered by the arrival of the king's personal guard. Isolde, Captain Alaric, barked, his heavy armor clanking as his voice echoed off the soot-stained stone walls. "The king commands your presence in the royal wing. Immediately." Martha, the head cook, dropped her wooden spoon, her face draining of all color. The entire kitchen fell deathly silent. Isolde felt her stomach plummet into an endless abyss. She wiped her trembling flour-coated hands on her coarse apron, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. She was entirely convinced she was going to be thrown into the dungeons or executed for daring to touch the princess, for polluting the royal bloodline with her lowly Omega presence. As she was escorted by the towering guards through the winding, tapestry-lined corridors of the Ironclaw fortress, the stark, agonizing difference between her previous life and her current reality became painfully clear. The fortress was a monument to power, with high vaulted ceilings and walls adorned with the weapons of conquered foes. Isolde felt smaller than a mouse, keeping her eyes glued to the stone floor. When the heavy iron-wrought oak doors to the King's Solar finally groaned open, Isolde stepped inside her, breathing shallow. She kept her gaze firmly fixed on the intricate crimson carpets woven by the ancient house of Plantagenet, a legendary real-life noble bloodline whose descendants still quietly mingled with the high-born wolf packs of the northern continent. "Leave us," a deep, gravelly voice commanded. The guards immediately bowed and exited the heavy doors, clicking shut with a horrifying, echoing finality. Isolde dropped into a deep, shaking curtsy, her knees hitting the floor hard. "My king, I beg your absolute forgiveness," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "I did not mean to overstep with the princess. I only wished to comfort. Rise, Isolde." The gentle, almost velvet tone of his voice shocked her into silence. Slowly, hesitantly, she looked up. Alpha King Rambo stood by the massive, roaring hearth, bathed in the soft morning light, filtering through the stained glass windows. He was not wearing his crown of spiked iron, nor his intimidating battle armor. He wore a simple, beautifully tailored linen shirt and dark trousers. He looked less like a fearsome warlord and more like a weary, hopeful man. But it was his eyes that caught her entirely off guard. They were a striking stormy grey, and they were entirely devoid of the cruel superiority and disgust that Rhys had always weaponized against her. Instead, Rambo's eyes held a tempest of warmth, vulnerability, and a desperate, raw hope. "You have absolutely nothing to apologize for," Rambo said softly, stepping forward, but stopping carefully to maintain a respectful, non-threatening distance. "For 3 years, the greatest healers, shamans, and doctors of this realm have failed my daughter. Yet a single Omega from the kitchens brought her back to me. You mended far more than a broken wooden toy yesterday, Isolde." Still reeling from the shock, Isolde listened as Rambo proposed a new arrangement, outlining her drastically elevated status with the absolute authority of a monarch. From that day forward, Isolde's life was entirely rewritten. Her new reality included royal governess and companion. She was officially appointed as Cecilia's primary caretaker. She would answer to no one in the castle but the king himself. Luxurious quarters. She was immediately moved from the freezing, drafty servants' quarters to a breathtaking suite adjoining the princess's chambers, complete with a feather bed and roaring fireplaces. Elite protection. 2 of the king's most lethal guards were assigned to shadow her and the princess at all times, ensuring they were never harassed by the sneering, judgmental nobles of the court. The transition, however, was not entirely without friction. The high-born members of the Ironclaw court, particularly the notoriously vain Lady Catherine of the ancient house of Beaufort, who had long vied to become the king's second wife, were utterly scandalized. They whispered viciously behind their silk fans in the grand halls, outraged that a nameless, rejected Omega was suddenly clothed in fine velvet gowns and dining mere steps from the royal dais. They tried to intimidate her with icy glares and veiled insults about her lineage, but Isolde, hardened by the brutal rejection of her past, simply ignored the venomous whispers. Her entire world, her entire focus became Cecilia. Over the next 3 months, the gloomy Ironclaw fortress witnessed a breathtaking miracle. Isolde's gentle, unwavering patience acted as a soothing balm on the child's shattered mind. First came the shy, fleeting smiles. Then came the soft, tinkling laughter echoing in the gardens. And finally, on a crisp, golden autumn afternoon, the final wall crumbled. Isolde was sitting on a velvet séaille, gently brushing and braiding Cecilia's dark hair, weaving small, pale blue ribbons into the plaits. "There," Isolde murmured, tying the final knot. "Like a proper little warrior princess." Cecilia reached up her tiny fingers, tracing the intricate braid. She turned to look at Isolde, her dark eyes clear and bright. "Beautiful," the little girl whispered, her voice raspy but impossibly sweet, touching the golden threads of Isolde's sleeve. Across the room, Rambo, who had been quietly reading military reports at his mahogany desk, froze completely. The expensive feather quill snapped cleanly in his massive hand ink, spilling across the parchment. He looked at his daughter, then at Isolde. The fierce Alpha King, the conqueror of the North, openly wept tears of pure, unadulterated joy for the second time in his life. It was in these quiet domestic moments that the invisible bond between Rambo and Isolde began to weave itself into something indestructible. Rambo remained endlessly patient. He absolutely refused to rush the mate bond, recognizing the deep, festering scars Rhys had left on her soul. Instead, he courted her through profound respect and actions. He asked her opinions on pack welfare. He ensured her favorite wild heather was always freshly arranged in her room, and he treated her with a deep reverence that healed her broken spirit piece by piece. Isolde slowly began to realize that true alpha strength wasn't the ruthless, tearing cruelty of the Silverpine pack. True strength was the gentle, ironclad restraint of a powerful man who actively chose to be kind. However, peace is a fragile commodity in the werewolf realm, and the past rarely stays buried. As the brutal northern winter approached, bringing with it a bitter, killing frost that froze the rivers solid, a desperate, freezing delegation arrived at the heavily fortified gates of the Ironclaw fortress. The Silverpine pack, suffering from a devastating famine and a mysterious blight that had wiped out their autumn crops, had come to humble themselves. They came to beg the Ironclaw king for grain shelter and a military alliance to survive the season. Leading the shivering delegation was the aging Lord Godfrey, and standing at his right hand, looking bitter and desperate, was the newly appointed Alpha of Silverpine Rhys. The grand banquet hall was a symphony of light and opulence. Thousands of beeswax candles illuminated the cavernous room, reflecting off the silver goblets and the jewels worn by the attending nobility. The Iron Claw pack was displaying its wealth, a strategic move by Rambo to assert dominance over the desperate Silverpine delegation. Isolde sat at the high table, seated directly to the right of King Rambo, with Princess Cecilia nestled happily in her lap. Isolde was a vision. The ragged kitchen maid was gone, replaced by a woman radiating quiet power. She wore a gown of midnight blue velvet, embroidered with silver threads, and a delicate diamond circlet rested in her dark hair, a gift from the king. Below the dais, Rhys sat with the Silverpine delegation, nursing a cup of wine, his face a mask of bitter resentment. He had been forced to swallow his pride and beg the Ironclaw king for survival. But as his eyes scanned the high table, he froze. His wine goblet slipped from his grasp, clattering loudly against his plate, spilling crimson liquid across the white linen tablecloth. He stared at the woman sitting beside the fearsome king. It was impossible. Isolde. The weak, pathetic Omega he had thrown away like garbage was sitting at the right hand of the most powerful ruler in the realm, draped in jewels and glowing with a radiant, healthy aura. A twisted, ugly possessiveness flared in Rhys's chest. In his arrogant mind, an Omega belonged to her first pack, regardless of a rejection. He convinced himself she was merely a concubine, a plaything the king had dressed up to mock him. When the feast concluded and the musicians began to play, the guests mingled. Rambo was briefly pulled aside by his generals to discuss the terms of the Silverpine Treaty. Isolde remained at her seat, gently wiping a crumb from Cecilia's cheek. Well, well, it seems the little stray found a warm bed to crawl into. A cruel, familiar voice sneered. Isolde went rigid. She slowly looked up to see Rhys, standing before the dais, flanked by two of his cronies. He looked haggard, the weight of his failing pack showing in the dark circles under his eyes, but his arrogance remained entirely intact. "I must admit you clean up nicely, Isolde," Rhys mocked, crossing his arms. "But don't think you can play queen forever. You're still just a broken, worthless Omega. When the king tires of you, you'll be back in the dirt where you belong." A year ago, these words would have shattered her. She would have cowered, cried, and accepted his abuse. But as Isolde looked at the man who had destroyed her, she felt nothing but a profound, overwhelming pity. "You are mistaken, Alpha Rhys," Isolde said, her voice calm, steady, and carrying across the suddenly quietening hall. "I am not broken. The cracks were filled with gold, and I have become something you will never be." She stood up, her posture perfect, her chin raised. "I am a survivor." Rhys's face flushed with fury. Humiliated by an Omega in front of the Ironclaw court, his volatile temper snapped. "You belong to Silverpine. You belong to me," he roared, lunging forward to grab her arm. He never made it. A monstrous, suffocating pressure slammed into the room. It was an alpha aura so potent, so violently protective that half the room was forced to their knees. A deafening snarl ripped through the air, shaking the very foundations of the castle. Before Rhys could even blink, a massive hand clamped around his throat, lifting him entirely off the ground. Alpha King Rambo stood there, his eyes glowing a terrifying, unnatural crimson. The air around him practically crackled with lethal intent. "Touch her!" Rambo's voice was a demonic, overlapping growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "And I will eradicate your bloodline from the annals of history." Lord Godfrey and the Silverpine delegation fell to their knees in sheer terror, begging for mercy. Rhys clawed at Rambo's hand, choking his face, turning purple. She She is my rejected Omega." He gasped out, his ignorance blinding him to his impending death. "She is nothing." Rambo's eyes narrowed into slits of pure, unadulterated wrath. He did not snap Rhys's neck, though it would have taken only a fraction of an ounce of pressure. Instead, he dropped the pathetic alpha to the floor like a sack of rotten grain. Rambo turned his back on the gasping Rhys and walked up the steps of the dais. He stopped in front of Isolde, the terrifying monster, vanishing in an instant, replaced by a man looking at his universe. Slowly, gracefully, the fearsome Alpha King of the Ironclaw pack sank to one knee before the Omega. The entire banquet hall erupted into shocked gasps, then fell into a deathly, stunned silence. "She is not a rejected Omega," Rambo proclaimed, his deep voice resonating with absolute, unwavering devotion. He took Isolde's hand, pressing a tender kiss to her knuckles. "She is my fated mate, the savior of my daughter, the keeper of my heart, and by the laws of the goddess and the blood of the Ironclaw, she is your queen." The silence held for exactly one heartbeat before the Ironclaw warriors slammed their fists over their hearts, dropping to their knees in a thunderous wave of absolute loyalty. "Long live the Queen! Long live Queen Isolde!" Rhys watched in horrified devastation as the woman he had discarded was elevated to a goddess before his very eyes. The treaty was signed, but under brutal terms, Silverpine would become a vassal state, heavily taxed, and Rhys was permanently stripped of his Alpha title, banished to the wasteland borders to serve in the vanguard for the rest of his miserable life. That night, standing on the balcony of their royal chambers, overlooking the snow-covered mountains, Rambo wrapped his heavy fur cloak around Isolde's shoulders from behind, pulling her flush against his chest. "You saved us," he whispered into her hair, kissing the crook of her neck where the mate mark would soon lay. "You mended this broken family." Isolde leaned back into his embrace, watching Cecilia sleep peacefully in the adjacent room through the cracked door. She smiled a true, brilliant smile, realizing the pain of her past was simply the crucible required to forge her beautiful golden future. "No, my love," Isolde murmured softly, intertwining her fingers with his. "We mended each other." Isolde's journey from a discarded broken Omega to the revered queen of the Ironclaw pack proves that the deepest wounds can become our greatest strengths. Sometimes rejection isn't the end of your story. It's just the painful push you need to find where you truly belong. If Isolde and Rambo's incredible story of healing revenge and destined love captured your heart, hit that like button, share this tale with a fellow romantic, and subscribe to our channel for more epic werewolf drama.